What's up guys, welcome back, hope you're doing well. Today's video is going to be a little bit more advanced, so for our novices and beginners I recommend you skip this video or at least do not take it into account when building your program until you reach the early intermediate phase, like I am. So in this video we are going to discuss a certain thing, and that is, as lifters we have this fear of leaving gains on the table, right? We usually want to get the most out of every set, the most out of every exercise. We are always looking for new options to improve our programs and to get more results. And usually this fear of missing out is unfounded because we end up doing things right. But in this specific case for this video, we're going to talk about a factor that, if ignored, is going to lead to you leaving gains on the table. And this factor is the weighted stretch. So you have heard it multiple times, right? Get that weighted stretch, do, for example, dips to stretch your chest. The Romanian deadlift has a stretch on the hamstring, so do it, and stuff like that. The weighted stretch is very important. But in this video, I'm not going to tell you just to incorporate it into your program. I think you already know that. No, what I'm going to tell you is to prioritize it, to make it a priority of yours, almost at the same level as progressive overload. Of course, I'm going to start with some disclaimers, and that is that it does not replace progressive overload. It's a separate way of getting more gains. The second thing, you should not only do eccentrics for growth. I am saying that you should prioritize it, okay? Not ignore the rest. So, eccentrics have their own function, right? They work for something else, but they should not be ignored. They should be done like a supplement for eccentrics, basically. The second point is, I am not recommending going for the stretch, okay, so emphasizing the weighted stretch in this specific scenarios. So the first one is going to be, the stretch puts you in a very, very risky position, like preacher curls. I am not going to tell you to grab a dumbbell, right, and to stretch all the way out when doing a preacher curl. That's going to, of course, lead to injury. The second point is that it forces you to use bitch weight, so very, very lightweight, like for example preacher curls or very inclined curls. So like the more inclined it is, the more you're going to emphasize the weighted stretch. Since yes, you're going to get that stretch, it's going to be a lot of internal force done in the muscle fibers when you're doing it, but for the rest of the range of motion, it's just going to be nothing, right? So let's say here you can only handle like 5 kilograms, but then for the rest of the movement, you can handle like 15 or even 20. For me, it doesn't make sense to have a lot of internal force here, but then it's just lightweight here, right? Lightweight baby. So in that specific case, I would recommend find another variation that allows you to smooth out that force demand, right? The rest of the range of motion is going to be garbage. There's a way of properly performing this type of stretch exercises, which is lengthen partials. So if this is the only challenging part, because this is just garbage, because it's very lightweight, then just do this, right? There's a way of implementing that I'm going to give you in the next sections, but I would only recommend doing it with exercise that allow for freer movement, right? And not taxing on the joints and having a significant amount of tension at the bottom. So if you're working with bands, I wouldn't recommend, like for example, just a regular band curl. I wouldn't recommend you doing lengthened partials because at the bottom there's practically no tension with the band, right? But if you're using, for example, a dumbbell and you have all the tension in the bicep at the bottom, right, you're doing like a very inclined curl, you can do partials. Or if you're doing a Bayesian curl or a band Bayesian curl, in that case there's still tension at the bottom, so you can perform it properly. So for preacher curls, dumbbell flies, bench press, dumbbell kickbacks, whoever does them, I wouldn't recommend going for the weighted stretch and definitely not doing lengthened partials. You could try it with ring or deficit push-ups, band cable Bayesian curls, cable ring flies, T-bar rows, among other movements, right? The fourth, is going to be, you have a high tendon sensitivity in that area, especially the elbows and the shoulders. or if your tendons are not prepared to handle it. So if you're just, that's why I made it that disclaimer at the beginning of the video of not including novices and beginners, because if you have someone that has never done, for example, bench press or very deep push-ups in their life, and they start going for that stretch just out of the get-go without building the tendon strength to do it, right, they're going to end up snapped up. You have to work up your tendon capacity to handle those stretch positions, and once you're able to handle it without issue, that's when you can start experimenting with the weighted stretch. I wouldn't also recommend doing it in low rep ranges for obvious reasons. 1 to 5, avoid. 6 is kind of iffy. I would go for 8 to 15 at least. So yeah, we can start with the thesis now after all of those disclaimers, and we're going to start with the anecdotal section, okay? So I'm going to talk about both the anecdotal evidence and the science evidence. Well, I'm not going to talk about the science evidence. I'm just going to leave it in the description if you want to read the studies and tell me what's wrong with them, and I'll happily hear you. So, with the anecdotal evidence, if you take a look at every single natty lifter that exhibit amazing development in one area in particular, for example, you have Alpha Destiny with the traps, you have NH with the biceps, JF with the triceps, Bald Omni-Man with his back, and so many others, right? You'll see something that they have in common. That overdeveloped body part is was usually developed with weighted stretch. So we have, for example, Alpha Destiny. He did a shit ton of rack pulls above the knee. He did power shrugs, cheated rows. He did a lot of deadlift. He did deadlift specialization with the trap bars, with the high handles. So he got a lot of weighted stretch, and his traps, of course, blew up. Then you look at JF. JF is always doing cable pushdowns, but also a lot of extensions. His biceps are huge, and guess what? He does incline curls, a lot of them. NH, how did he grow his biceps? Cheat curls. Bald Omni-Man, how did he have his back? With seal rows and with pull-ups. Now, although pull-ups and rows, like with the Bald Omni-Man example, are hardest at the top, right? They still have an amazing stretch. Even if the scapula is disengaged, you still get an amazing lat stretch or upper back stretch in general. This is similar to band Bayesian curls, which it is technically concentric focus, but there is still a pretty good stretch at the bottom. So that's why I said you could do lengthened partials with band Bayesian curls, because you still have a lot of tension at the bottom and it's still going to stretch the muscle. So it still applies. You'll hardly ever see a guy, and now applying the opposite, you'll hardly ever see a guy that only does concentric focus training, right, and is jacked. And funnily enough, the people that recommend getting that squeeze, getting that concentric, and prioritizing the squeeze over the lengthening is usually steroid users and the Ls, like a certain personal trainer that I'm not going to mention. So yeah, that's the first point. The second point is going to be activity-specific physiques. So if you look at any athlete, right, except for chess, of course, and or manual laborers, you'll see that their physiques reflect on their activities, right? Usually they have one overdeveloped body part, like in the case of like the previous point. That is the one that takes the brunt of the work. And looking at this, you can point out two different factors. The first one is nucleus overload. So you have high frequency, high volume, low intensity, with blood flow constantly going to the area. So this seems to contradict what I previously said about the eccentrics. You have, for example, ballerinas that are constantly in calves. They have huge calves, and they're constantly squeezing their calves to remain in that up position. Then you have swimmers with back and shoulders, and mechanics with their forearms. There's not a lot of stretch when you're swimming, and when you're like using, I don't know how you call it, you're basically squeezing, you're not stretching anything. The second factor you'll see is, you guessed it, a stretch. Man, every single time I record a video there's a motorbike. It's unbelievable. The second point, again, is going to be, you guessed it, a stretch. For gymnasts, for example, with their biceps and shoulders, traps, calm the fuck on, dude. Gymnasts with their shoulders and biceps, traps for African laborers, and climbers with the forearms. Now, You could attribute most of the gains to nucleus overload. That's totally plausible. But you have to take something into account. If you compare the people that are doing basically nucleus overload and the guys that are doing nucleus overload and a weighted stretch, you'll see a lot of difference in their physiques. Compare a gymnast to a swimmer in terms of shoulders or biceps. Compare a mechanic to a climber, or compare, like in the size of the forearms, sorry, give me a sec. Yeah, compare a gymnast to a swimmer in terms of shoulders, or a climber to a mechanic in terms of forearms. With this, you can perfectly see that the weighted stretch plays an added factor to the nucleus overload. So that could indicate another pathway to hypertrophy outside of progressive overload and nucleus overload. The third one is going to be personal experience. So, in my own fitness journey, I can safely say that looking back and evaluating what I did, the moment I started prioritizing the stretch was the moment my back, my biceps, everything started to blow up. A couple examples are when I started slowing down the eccentric on pull-ups, rows and face pulls, and ring push-ups, my chest and upper back got huge. The moment I started doing pelican curls instead of ring curls, my biceps started growing fast. Then, when I switched to regular handstand push-ups to ring pike push-ups, which stretch the shoulders, my shoulders blew up, and so on. And this one hurts me a lot to say, but when I started going to the gym and switched from band pushdowns and band extensions, although I love my band work, I have to say, once I started doing cable pushdowns, cable extension, lying EC bar extensions, and doing actually ring extensions more because my tendon already healed, my triceps got bigger. So in my personal experience, adding weighted stretch gave me a lot of gains. If you look at people in the real world, you'll see that the ones that have a weighted stretch component usually have more development compared to those that don't. And for natty lifters that you can see in the YouTube community, the body parts that they have overdeveloped is usually the one that was subjected to the most weighted stretch. So that's to take into account. Now, for the science section, you can see basically, if you check the studies, for example, and I'm not going to cite the studies, you can check in the description, but basically if you check what I left in the description box, you can see that there seems to be a noticeable difference at worst and a pretty blatant one at best, that emphasizing the eccentric or longer muscle lengths seems to provide a much better hypertrophy outcome. I found some evidence, of course, that countered this idea, but most of them I couldn't access because they were behind a paywall. And Sci-Hub, I swear to God, this is a real website, I'm not shitting you, and it's not what you think, doesn't seem to care about hypertrophy training, so I couldn't access the studies. So if you're kind enough to shoot me a DM telling me how wrong a study was, or you found a study that counters what I have to say, please tell me. My Instagram is @proteinmansupremacy, so yeah, I'll be waiting for your DM. Now that I have shown you the breadcrumbs that led me to this conclusion, I'm going to give you my approach on how to do it. We're going to start with the master plan, title property of Frenchman Limited Liability Company. We're going to start with the first point, which is going to be start slowing down your eccentrics. So it doesn't have to be a 5-second lowering phase, for example, with pull-ups. You don't have to be like this. Just control the eccentric and also consider adding pauses at the bottom. And if you want, you can also add it to the top to really highlight where the eccentric starts, and you can really allow the muscles to feel that lengthening position. The second is going to be form or body position manipulation. For example, in the case of pull-ups, as I previously mentioned, you can try keeping the scapula engaged like this, right? If that helps you in stretching the lats more. Also, you can have spinal flexion to even more emphasize the lat stretch. When doing ring push-ups, you can have a proud chest, try to open up the rib cage as much as possible to really stretch that chest. When doing vertical pressing, instead of doing a 90 degree, right, you can try having a 60 to 85 degree angle, so you can get your hands in front of you and really stretch the front delt. Staying more upright, doing pushdowns, that's going to emphasize the eccentric, And if you know how to use your long head on pushdowns, it's going to give you a massive long head stretch. And when doing dumbbell curls, for example, you can try pinning your arms close together. That's going to be a game changer that's going to give you a lot of results, okay? Now, if you want to get more, what's the word that Greg Doucette uses a lot? Pedantic. If you want to get more pedantic or more into minutia, I'm going to give you a general template you can follow for you to structure your hypertrophy routines for every muscle group. So you should follow the heavy 30, stretch 45, pump 25 template. I'm going to leave the script in the description so you can check what it says so you are not lost. But basically, for a certain muscle group, you want to start the session or the week, in the case you spread it throughout the week, your volume, with a heavy hitter movement. So if you do it in a session, you start with a heavy hitter movement, or you do it in one session and then the next sessions you do the rest. So you have a heavy hitter movement in the 4 to 6 or 5 to 8 rep range. That is going to give you a big overall stimulus to the muscles involved. You should use 2 to 4 reps in reserve, as I previously talked about in my videos, and you want to make it 25 to 30% of the muscle's workload. Then you want to move to a spammable or isolation movement. If it is in a session, you have your first movement, then you have your second movement, or you have your first session. For example, let's say you're doing it 3 times a week, you have your heavy hitter movement session, then you have the pump 25 in the middle, and then you have your stretch 45 on Friday, right? That would be a very workable template. But let's keep going. You want to basically have your heavy hitter, then you have then you want to move to a spammable or isolation movement depending on the target muscle. So let's say you want to grow your chest, you're going to be doing heavy bench press, then you move on to close grip bench or ring push-ups, or if you want to grow your triceps, you start with weighted dips, for example, then you move on to bodyweight extensions or lying tricep extensions with an easy bar. Depending on the target muscle, that puts it in a weighted stretch position. As I said, you first have your heavy hitter movement, then you move on to a movement that's going to stretch that muscle. It follows the HSP Team 3D Alpha template, if you're clever enough to remember that. So basically we start with a heavy movement, then we move on to the stretch. You want to basically put it in a safe position, so you're not going to be doing preacher curls, you're going to be doing incline curls, for example, or Bayesian curls, or band Bayesian curls, something like that, for example, for your biceps. And it should preferably be length and focus. So it can be a mid-length focus movement as long as there is tension in the bottom. So for example, cable curls, they're technically hardest in the middle, but they still have a stretch on the bottom. You can try doing length and partials even. But yeah, as long as there is a decent amount of tension in the bottom, it should be fine. Here you could do length and partials, as I said. Try to use higher to moderate reps, 8 to 15 for more sensitive areas, and 6 to 10 for less sensitive ones. So if your elbows are a bitch, try using 8 to 15. But if you can handle a little lower reps, you can go for 6 to 10. You can work up to that. There's not a lot of issues as long as you take the right precautions. For length and partials though, I would recommend to go 10 to 15 or even 10 to 20 because you're constantly going to the stretch position. You may not want to really go heavy, so I would recommend, again, go higher reps. That's also going to help to build that tissue resilience. For these ones, I would recommend go to 2 reps in reserve or to just 0 reps in reserve. This should be the bulk of your body parts workload. And then as a finisher, you basically grab an isolation movement or spammable in some cases that are concentric focus, and they are going to be basically used to add blood into the area, to pump, and it's going to, of course, drop blood into the area, promote tendon health. Second, add tonnage. As I said, the concentric has its own purpose, and it's going to be adding tonnage to the area without taxing the tendons. That's the purpose of the concentric, okay? And the third one is going to allow you to enhance your mind-muscle connection, although this is very overrated by Reuters. It's still important. for example, for compounds, because you'll see later, you can actually do the pump work first as a warm-up. I would recommend for this one, use 0 reps in reserve as a baseline, and I would recommend actually to go beyond failure via partials. Like for example, you start at 100% range of motion, then once you fail, you do 90%, then 80%, then 70%, and like that until you're basically doing baby reps. You can also, I would recommend for this specific type of movement, to fail in the 8 to 12 or 10 to 15 rep range, and then go beyond failure with that. It should be 25% of your workload. And before finishing the video, I want to say that this order is not fixed. The proportions are. So you want to remain with that 30% heavy, 45% stretch, and 25% pump. So if you prefer, you can try, if it works better for your tendons, you can try doing pump, heavy, stretch, or heavy, pump, stretch. So basically, for example, for me at least, it works to have a pump exercise before the stretching exercise, but for some people, it may be better to have the pump exercise before the compound. Let's say you have an arm day and you want to start with close grip bench, you can basically do a couple sets of pushdowns, right, band pushdowns, to really warm up the area and to get blood into the area, and that's also going to allow you to feel your triceps more during the close grip bench. And then you move on to the stretch and you're already very warmed up. And on top of that, you're not going to be using that much weight, so you're going to get more out of less weight. But again, you have to maintain that proportion of 30, 45, 25. And yeah, that's basically the whole video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Tell me what you think in the comments below, and thanks for watching.